When moving abroad, I think there are certain things that are really important to consider. When moving to Italy, even more things that you need to take into consideration. But as I've said in so many episodes of Not Your Average Globetrotter, that sometimes the smallest things can make the biggest differences. Recently, I came across an article from the Business Insider from writer Miranda Mullings, and she had some interesting things to say, and I think based on what she's said in this article, entitled, at least at the current time of recording this episode, I moved from the US to Rome for a slower pace of life, but after 7 years, I've realized I'll never fully adjust to some Italian ways. I read part of this article, and it got me thinking about some of the important things that you really need to prepare for when moving abroad. And we're not talking about just like getting your paperwork, your visas, your documents all in order, and not even just learning the language, although learn the language, it makes a big difference, but also the mental side of living in another part of the world. Living on the other side of the world, or even moving to the country next door, can come with some challenges and things that you really have to think about, and also being ready to accept them and ready for the challenge that's coming up. But anyway, I'm Rafael Di Furia. Let's just jump into the rest of the episode. This is another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, and roll that intro. So let's pop these glasses on. And so again, from Miranda Mullings on this article posted on November 21st, 2024. I moved to Italy in my 20s after a summer study abroad in Rome during my senior year of college. Of course, as I've said before in many episodes, studying abroad can be a great way to start kind of exploring living abroad, but in the kind of educational world, when you're just kind of a student, you're living in a bubble. You're not having the full experience of properly living in the country. So I can't help but wonder if that's actually the best way to get started, but it's an interesting way to explore. It doesn't mean it's a great way to start your life though, but we'll continue on with what she has to say. What I thought would be a few months of living, la dolce vita, in the historic city turned into much more after I met my husband and my internship turned into a full-time job. I mean, that's firstly great for her that she was able to turn an internship into a full-time job. A lot of people don't have that ability to be able to do that and to actually make a career for themselves, because that also could involve having to get a visa to stay here, and not all jobs and businesses are going to want to sponsor a visa. So I don't know, but maybe because she's married to an Italian, that made it actually a little bit easier for her. But sounds like maybe she didn't get just one full-time job, but potentially two. Anyway, she continues on saying that 7 years later, I split my time between my first home, the US, and my second, Italy. I think this is actually very interesting and shows the mentality of where this person is at and how she kind of feels about things. And I'm going to get into this a little bit more later on, but in the next paragraph here, she also says something really interesting. Despite calling the US my real home, living overseas has changed my mindset, and I experience culture shock every time I transition between countries. Again, I really want to get into this point later, because I think when you're moving to another part of the world, it's really important to be open to new experiences. And if you're thinking about things in this way, I think it says a lot, especially between my first home, the US, and my second, Italy. It shows almost like a prioritization. And even if it's not necessarily what she intended, and even if it wasn't necessarily so much within the conscious mind, it's at least seemingly there subconsciously. But of course, Mama didn't raise no psychologist nor a telepath, so I am not going to pretend that I know what's going on in her head. But continuing on, she has to say, the biggest cultural differences are in everyday life. A big part of the dolce vita concept is that life moves slower. Yeah, that's part of it, but it's also about enjoying life. Who doesn't love the idea of unlimited coffee breaks, shorter working hours, and an August spent beachside? I mean, look, maybe she's kind of just speaking here and not necessarily being so literal, but unlimited coffee breaks, definitely not a thing. I mean, depends on what kind of work you're doing, but do people take coffee breaks? Definitely. Shorter working hours, most definitely. And an August spent beachside is something that to me does not sound very pleasant in Italy, because this is the time of year that is going to be the busiest, the most packed. You're going to feel like a sardine. And I would say if you're looking for a beach experience in Italy, there are probably better times to go other than August. But if you're living here and that's the time of year that you're given off, then okay, go take advantage of it. But it just so happens that almost everybody also has their time off in August as well. So you'll be spending your time at the beach with them. And going to the beach isn't always necessarily something free to do. A lot of the best beaches in Italy, you have to pay for your time, or if you're paying to be there though, you have to keep in mind you are probably going to at least get like a chair that you can lounge out on, and even an umbrella. So that's usually part of it. Some of them can be quite expensive and some of them can be inexpensive. It just depends on what type of place that you're going to. But continuing on, she has to say, in reality, it's not so pleasant at times. I think that's definitely a fair thing to say in any country. Then she continues on saying, I'm lucky if I can finish a task in a day. Italy isn't as online as the US, so you're better off going to a place in person rather than trying to call or email. And I wouldn't disagree, but I think things have been getting better there, and there are more services that are available online, but definitely not everything. And yes, getting a task completed in a single day can prove to be quite a challenge in Italy. But she then has to say that when I was trying to sign up for the national healthcare system, I went to the address listed on Google Maps. There's your problem. Only to find an unmarked building with a locked door. Outside of the US, I would definitely say that relying on Google Maps for hours can be very hit and miss, and especially in some parts of Southern Europe, you might see certain hours listed, but it doesn't mean those are the hours that they're actually keeping. You can consider them as a rough indication. It depends on the place, of course. But for official offices, definitely look at the website first. Don't rely on Google Maps, because the thing is also with Google Maps, the building could be open from X time to Y time, but the office that you might actually try to be going to might not be open the whole day, or it might only be open to public services or to the public period during a small window for a couple of hours. I mean, even banks can be like this at times. So you really do need to know what time of day that things are going to be open, closed, or what services are offered at certain times. But she goes on in this next paragraph saying, I waited for someone to come out so I could sneak in. And thankfully, I was able to find the registration office. But contrary to Google Maps, it was only open from 10 a.m. to noon, 3 days a week. So I was out of luck and had to return another day. I mean, I would say this is not an uncommon experience in Italy, but of course, this gets into what I've said in many episodes of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Sometimes it's these small things that can build up over time. She doesn't necessarily get into some of the most difficult things that can really kind of happen for somebody if they're dealing with things and maybe not adjusting well. But she does illustrate some of the differences that you can find that I think in the long run can actually end up building up for somebody. And a lot of these small things at the end of the day can actually end up being very big for your overall experience. But anyway, she goes on by saying, even after living in Italy for years, it's difficult for me to settle into this slower pace, especially in the weeks after returning from the US. And I think this part in particular connects very interestingly to what she was mentioning up above about the US being her first home, the real home, and how Italy's kind of in the second position for her. She goes on by saying, daily life back in the US is much more convenient and requires less energy to get things done. I'll take the DMV over an Italian post office any day. I think that it really depends on what you're trying to accomplish there. If you're trying to send something, okay, yeah, you can end up waiting in line for a long time. But it also depends on what you're trying to do, because I mean, if you're trying to access banking at the post office, do they have a special banking teller there? Or are you competing for people who are also trying to get their phone stuff done or pay their bills? You can do a lot in an Italian post office. So I don't necessarily blame her for having that opinion, but I don't know. I might be the opposite and take an Italian post office over dealing with the DMV. But it's an interesting point nonetheless. She continues on by saying, it's difficult to adjust to what's socially acceptable in each country. Despite being a city of more than 2.5 million people, Rome feels like a cluster of small villages. And that, I think, is another really interesting point, and I agree with her. And that's definitely been my experience. But I think this actually could be said about a lot of cities, and not just in Italy, that in general, if you're living in a big city, I can't help but wonder what type of area that she grew up in. I really don't know, so I'm not going to make an assumption. But I think in general, in a lot of cities, you end up living in your area mostly. And unless you have to go to another part of town for something that is specifically there, then you have no reason to. So that ends up creating this much smaller kind of bubble within this greater bubble. Not that you're necessarily living in a bubble, but just to pop that idea, I think when you are looking at life in a small town versus life in a big city, yes, you have all these small towns that are kind of all clustered together. But the thing that makes it really different is that you can have access to these other places much more easily. Okay, granted, if you're in a huge city, it can take a long time to get from one area to another. That's another topic for another day. Anyway, she continues by saying, the close-knit community made it hard for me as an outsider to fit in at first. I don't think that's necessarily specifically a Rome thing. And I think this is actually something that I've talked about in many episodes, is that in Italy, people tend to be a bit more kind of closely, tightly knit. And the friends that maybe you had from a young age are going to probably remain your friends for a much longer amount of time, unless you're moving from a small city to a bigger city. Then it's a little bit different, but kind of breaking into social circles and communities can present challenges, I've noticed. If you marry into it, then it's maybe a little bit of a different situation. But it is interesting, though, that I feel as though, and I've mentioned this in previous episodes, that I feel like I see many stories about foreign women, and especially when we're talking about content in English, American women coming to Italy, meeting an Italian guy, but I don't necessarily see so many stories or see creators that have gone the other way, where it's an Italian woman that meets an American guy. I don't know. It makes me curious. I just think that it's very interesting from a cultural standpoint, what attracts one to the other more, or I don't know. Some big generalizations could be made, but it's something that I'm curious about why that might be. And maybe it's just the guys aren't out there creating content so much. That could be part of it. But she goes on by saying this was even more difficult because I wasn't used to some of the social norms in Italy, where asking personal questions and openly staring at others aren't considered rude like in the US. People would probe me in the beginning, asking about how my family accepted me living so far from home. And she remembered calling her mom one day, crying after walking through the neighborhood and feeling like all eyes were on her. And so here's the thing. This is another aspect that I'm talking about. Sometimes it's the small little things that can make these big differences. I mean, it does sound like a very intense reaction to that situation. I don't know what she was going through, or if there was any other context that made her cry here, and so I'm not going to call that into question. It does sound like a very big, shocking thing to go through, especially if you're not used to it. And I know for me, I remember the first times that I came to Italy as a kid and seeing people staring, and not just like eyes following you and head not moving, but like full on, like actually head turning, following you as you're walking down the street. And I found it very unsettling at the time. It's something that at this point in time, and it's not unique to Italy. I mean, I've seen this also in other Southern European countries as well as the Middle East. And it's something I wouldn't say I necessarily notice so much anymore, and I've gotten used to it. But I can imagine as a young woman in a new country that this could actually be very, very concerning and make you very uncomfortable. So that's why I'm not judging her on such a strong reaction like that. But she continues by saying that she's become more comfortable in Italy over the years, especially after she became fluent in Italian, which significantly boosted her self-confidence. And again, this is what I'm always saying, learn the language. Boosting the self-confidence, I mean, we're talking about going between not being able to do anything for yourself and being able to get to the point where you can kind of walk and talk on your own. You're not feeling like a little toddler that's only able to say, Mama, Dada, help me, please, hungry, sleepy, cuddles, whatever it might be. Once you get to a certain point where you can actually communicate with others, even if it's not perfectly. Fluency, I think, is a beautiful thing to get to that point, but not everybody's going to get there. And to get to the point where you can have a conversation and just get your points across is very, very important, regardless of the country that you're in. But anyway, she continues by saying that Italian culture has also changed her perspective on what's socially acceptable in the US. And if Italian society is overbearing, American society can feel a bit isolating. I think this is actually really interesting that people do jump into these kind of more personal topics what people from North America might consider a little bit more personal and hold a little bit closer to them and not really get into so much. But what might be considered inappropriate to discuss here might be a little bit different. And I know some people, for example, find it very rude to ask, or to be asked, what is your job? Like, what type of work do you do? Like within the first meeting of meeting somebody, it's almost the equivalent of asking, how much money do you make? Or reducing the person to their job and not looking at the person as a person. But it's not that this doesn't happen. I mean, not everybody is like this. And I've met plenty of Italians who have no problem to ask, hey, what do you do? Like, what brought you here? Or what is this? Or what is that? And if you're in Italy, if you're going there, then I would say be prepared for people to be asking, well, why did you come here? Like, why would you come to Italy? This is not uncommon at all. But it's definitely true that Italian culture is quite the opposite of isolating. I mean, it's very communal. But I'm going to skip over just a couple of lines here. If you want to read through this, I'll try to remember to leave a link to this down in the comment section below this episode on YouTube. Go read it. You can see what she has to say. But to skip to the end here, she says, Italy can be challenging, and I know I'll never stop being surprised by the cultural quirks, but I feel fortunate to have the best of both in my life. And I can totally get what she means. I mean, there are certain things like she talks about, like Italian homes and where time is spent and mentalities, but I think even though she's not necessarily getting into the kind of the discussion that I've had in the past, I think these are the first steps towards that when you are living in another country, you have to really be mentally open to making your life happen in that country. And if you are divided between the two countries, that can create unnecessary challenges for you. Even she mentioned about transitioning between the two countries and going back and forth. I mean, sometimes I try to put myself into the shoes of my family that came to the US. And I mean, even one of my parents, and then going back even not so long, I was raised in very much of with these kind of immigrant kind of ideals or immigrant families that you're raised, especially from the Italian part of my family, the Di Furia line directly. I mean, that was a huge impact on my life, being told from a very young age about the stories of the pictures painted of this country, that how things were and what life was like, and how at one point in time the water was so dirty in the town where our family came from that even the children had to be drinking wine because that was the only thing that was safe to drink. Being raised with this direct influence on my life. I mean, it wasn't just that I was brainwashed, it was brain scrubbing at that point. And so it made a huge impact on me, who I am and how I am today. And this is something that I think can go through a family line where you can have this love for a country transferred based on kind of the experiences shared. And also, if it was even more so from a positive place, that someone that you're a family member that you're very fond of, I think that creates much more of an influence. So for me, a couple generations down the line on one side, and then like first generation born in the US on the other side, like for me, I couldn't help but having this thing in the back of my mind that drew me in a different direction from a very young age. And even though my family settled in the US, there was still aspects of it not necessarily properly being home, even though they made it home. But for some of my family who came over to the US, there was very much the necessity to try and mentally divorce from the idea of going back. Because even if someone has a very strong desire to be in the country where they're from, it doesn't necessarily mean that the situation there is so fantastic for them. And maybe they can make a much better life for themselves elsewhere. And so this is something that I think is actually really interesting to consider, because it's not just one group of people that face this or one group of people that you see this in. But I saw for myself in the early days after leaving the US more than 16 years ago that I definitely had to do this for myself, divorcing myself from the idea of kind of being so tied to that part of the world. It was not easy, and it's still not easy. There are times that I still have this idea, oh man, what would it be like? That's kind of the emotional side of things, not properly logically thinking about like that I know it's not the right place for me. It's not been for a long time. And the things that come up for me are based on what once was, the experiences that I had, the friends that I had. And I mean, if I went back, it wouldn't be the same experience now. So I'm thinking about kind of the nostalgia of my time growing up. And so I think maybe I've been given an opportunity that I left at a young enough age that I could more easily divorce myself mentally from that side, just because that maybe I didn't have enough time to invest myself as an adult into that place and build up so much for myself there. But on the flip side, then I've had to do that in other places and building my life up in different countries. And I do think that there's an argument for actually living your life in one location after having lived in many locations myself. But I think using this particular individual, Miranda Mullings, specifically as an example here, that her first kind of home is America. The second one is Italy. And I think for anybody who is making a life for themselves in this part of the world, and I'm not judging her, but I'm saying just kind of in a general sense, I'm not saying what's right for her, what's wrong for her. I'm not trying to make a diagnosis of any kind. And I'm not pretending like I know what's going on in her head. Like I said earlier in this episode, just to be very clear, I am neither a psychologist nor a telepath. So I have no way of knowing these things for sure. But I would assume, generally speaking, for a person with that mindset, that there would be challenges for feeling totally at home outside of the US. But at the same time, I think it would actually present a challenge to her if she does see this place, or if a person in general sees another country as home as well. And especially being married to somebody who's from another nation, that there could be certain ties that are pulling in kind of both directions. And having family on the other side of the world also makes it challenging. And being on the phone with your family on the other side of the world is going to make you think about, oh my gosh, they're over there, I'm over here, things are so different, I can be lonely. And then when it comes to the holiday season, oh my gosh, where am I going to spend? And I'm going to be so far away, we're not going to be able to open up the trees and the presents and the this and the that and the other. Wait, you don't open up trees, whatever. Anyway, you get what I'm saying here. You open up the presents. But when it comes down to it, I think really being committed to living abroad is not just about practically making it possible, but mentally and emotionally making it possible for yourself and giving yourself enough time. And clearly she seems to have given herself quite a bit of time and potentially has actually made a life for herself. Again, I don't know anything about this person other than this particular article, but I would definitely say that in general, if you are living your life between two countries, where are you really living? Where are you? Where is your life? That can make it much more difficult if you're spending time in different locations, a little bit here, a little bit there, with this part of your family, with that part of your family. And separating yourself and cutting things off. I mean, I'm not saying, I would never say cut off yourself from your family. I'm the last person to say that. Unless things are very unhealthy, then that's a different sort of situation. But I think if you're looking to make a life abroad, that like an ex maybe, that you don't want to have communication with anymore, that it's maybe the best to close off certain things from that part of your life and to move on and to move forward. I get it, for many people that's not going to be possible because they've spent so much time in the US that maybe their finances are tied up there, or they have investments, or that they have family, that they have their kids, whatever it might be, that still keeps them tied to that place. But I think the more that you kind of go back and forth to that country or to any country, you present yourself with a challenge each time. And is that something that you really want to do? I mean, I'm just speaking my own perspective here, that I think in life it's best to kind of make as few challenges for yourself as possible. And is actually moving abroad a challenge that you can make for yourself? I think for many people, the answer is definitely yes. I think there are some people that are much better suited to it than others, and it's not for everybody, but I'm not saying that you should or shouldn't do it. And I'm not saying that she should or shouldn't have done it and that she's making any mistakes here, but it's just interesting to look at. I think even if you're doing everything in quote unquote the right way, whatever that might be, that you still can be pulled in different directions and have that difficulty. And even with what I'm talking about here, mentally divorcing yourself from another part of your life, from where you once were, you can still think about the good old times, and they can come back and make you think, well, maybe, should I, shouldn't I? What should I do? But anyway, I'm Rafael Di Furia. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter, as well as a huge thank you to those of you who help to make these episodes possible on a monthly basis through patreon.com/Rafael Di Furia, as well as the thanks button here on YouTube and rafaeldifuria.com/support. Of course, if you have any thoughts on anything discussed in this episode, it's an open conversation, so feel free to leave your comments down in the comment section below. But of course, again, I'm Rafael Di Furia. Stay safe and healthy out there, and I will see you all next time for another episode of Not Your Average Globetrotter. Later.